1848, while they were contemplating the building of the suspension bridge across the Niagara Gorge, they had an engineering problem to solve. And that problem was, how do we get the first cables from one side of the gorge to the other? We can't do it in a boat because the waters are too dangerous there and below. And so what the chief engineer came up with was, I think, a very novel idea. He said, let's have a kite flying competition. And we will give $5 to anyone who can fly a kite over the gorge so that we'll have a string connecting one side to the other. And so of the many, many people, including children, who participated, one 16-year-old was, as listed there, I don't know if I'm saying the first name right, but Holman Walsh. Holman Walsh went out on the day of the competition. Well, I think it was more than just a day of competition. First person who could do it. Flew a kite, managed to catch a good wind, lots of line on the kite over top of the gorge, pulling on it, and his string snapped. He lost his kite. But he learned his lesson. He realized that when flying a kite, you've got to work with the string. You can't pull on it with too much power or you're going to snap it. You also, of course, can't just let it go. It has no tension in it and it will just fall to the ground. And with those corrections, his kite, which was named Union, made its way from one side to the other, and that string then was connected to a rope which was pulled over the gorge, and that rope was connected to a cable pulled over the gorge, and that cable connected to one of the larger cables that would eventually begin the building of the suspension bridge. When you're pulling on that string, you got to be careful how much tension you're given or not given to it. Paul, in his letter today, is kind of flying a kite, or put differently, he's wrestling with his own understanding of how hard do I tug on this string. There is this strong connection between Paul and the church at Philippi, and he founded this church. And there's some conflict going on in it. He's got some issues, but the place brings him joy. They love and they care for him in his ministry, and he knows if he pulls too hard on the strings that he has, he could break the relationship. But if he says nothing, does nothing, well, how is he to keep the relationship going? If I can be so daring to do so, since it's Mother's Day, and all of this applies to all parents and grandparents, but there's something to learn about parenting from Paul's letter to the Philippians in this opening salutation. Paul is separated by distance from the congregation he gave birth to. Does that sound familiar, parents? You know, they're not living one day they will not live under your roof, and we'll wish that they could, at least on weekends. Paul, he loves not just the people, but the congregation like a child because he gave birth to it. It's like, I made you. Listen to me. Does that sound familiar, parents? I think it does. And so I think there's something that we can learn from this, because Paul's wrestling with, how do I pull the strings? What's too much? What is too little? Parenting, mothering, today we focus on has all of its worries and our kids get to a certain age when we stop worrying about them, right? Exactly. It's never ending, and we can feel as though, a few of these things. Even though our children are in their 30s, we're still responsible for them. Or even though our children are in their 60s, Mom, we still feel responsible for them. When they grow up and we launch them, we worry about them from a distance. And what Paul teaches us in this passage is what he learned, that we can turn that worry into remembrance. We'll talk more about that in a second. So here's what's going on with Paul. He still feels responsible for this congregation. Even though he's founded it, he's launched it, it's going well on its own for the most part. But he gave birth to it. And he must obviously have those worries. What if I'd have done this differently before I moved through town? Did I do enough with this part of this congregation? It's the question, when am I actually done when it comes to leading? That's got to be on Paul's mind. But Paul says this in this opening salutation: I am confident of this, that the one, namely God, that the one who began a good work in you will continue to complete it. What Paul knows is, even though he still feels like he is responsible, the congregation was never his in the first place. It belongs to God. And God will see it to completion. Again, does that sound familiar as parents? That we can be reminded that even though these are our children, and we feel a sense of ownership, of belonging, we're just part of something bigger than ourselves. That we're part of a mission that God has for our children, and we can entrust this to God. So that's the first thing. Yeah, we still feel responsible, but we've got a great partner in God. Second thing for Paul in this church at Philippi, as I mentioned before, he's at this distance. He's far away. He's not just far away, he's locked up in a prison in Rome, and you got a lot of time on your hands to think about things. You're sitting there alone in your room, and you wonder, how are my congregations doing? How are these people whose lives I've seen transformed, how are they doing? And so worry sets in. We know that even though we may be connected to something, and let's talk about being a parent or specifically a mother, sometimes you don't need an umbilical cord to feel connected to a child. Any adoptive parent or grandparent will tell you there's a cord stronger than that connects us to our children. That despite any geographical distance or the emotional distance of children who are establishing themselves in the world and they're too busy to reach out as often as we wish, we still feel that tug. That's what Paul is going through from prison. And he could let that worry not only overwhelm him, but shape what he says in his letter in an unproductive way. But he writes this in the salutation: for all of you are my partners in God's grace in my imprisonment and in the gospel. What Paul does here is he becomes aware that when I worry about my congregation, I can turn that worry into awareness that God's up to something, that I've entrusted to, in Paul's case, the congregation, its leadership, to carry on what I've given them. And with children, we can entrust them to work through the things we've instilled within them along the way. We will never stop worrying from a distance, but that worry need not paralyze us, because this is the other thing that Paul does. Paul, without saying it out loud, is teaching us that memory prompts prayer. When he's worried about his congregation, he remembers them. And when he remembers them, he prays for them. Worry becomes a prompt for doing something active. It's difficult there in the prison cell when you cannot do something. You feel like you're passive. Prayer is something active. Paul writes, I thank my God for every remembrance of you, always in every one of my prayers for all of you, praying with joy. When we worry about our children or our grandchildren, when we worry about the people who are closest to us, we're human. But that worry reminds us that we're part of a love project that God's involved in. And that reminds us that God's up to something in the life of this person for which we worry. And so the worry becomes a prompt for us to pray for God to continue working through the life of this child. Now, I said at the beginning of the sermon that maybe there's something that Paul's letter can teach us about parenting. Maybe something about Paul's letter that we can learn about Mother's Day. But you know, Paul probably learned all of this stuff from a mother. Paul probably learned how to manage the pulling and the letting go of that string by looking at the women who were able to establish these congregations, the ways in which they were able to push and pull just at the right time to bring people in. Being a loving, caring person, not only to our children, but to others in our lives, it can be as easy as flying a kite. Sometimes that kite gets away from us. Sometimes we don't know how to push and pull. But if we can keep hold of that relationship with the people that we love, not only will we keep them in our prayers, but we'll be reminded that God is up to something still today in our lives. Amen.